Good afternoon. My name is Gail G. Trell. I'm here today on Thursday, March 25th, 2010. I'm interviewing Carol Levine, and it is my pleasure to interview her. At this time also, Julian Reitman will be the videographer. And this is a history in her home at 88 Ridge Park Avenue, to be part of the oral history of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. I've been looking forward to this day to interview you. Okay. All right, Carol, we want to know a little bit about your history and your family. So let's begin possibly before you were born and talk a little bit about your parents and where they're from and their names.
Well, we're going way back.
Yes, we are.
Okay. Briefly, my mother was Leah Wilson, and she was born in Chester, Pennsylvania. And her father, my grandfather Wilson, had been one of those who had gotten out of the Tsar's army and gotten over here, and he started as a peddler, and then he built up the Wilson Furniture Store in Chester, Pennsylvania, which was quite successful. And my mother's mother had 4 children, and then she died, and then my grandfather married again and had 4 more children, so there were 8 in that family. My mother was a young, pretty teenager. Now, getting to my father was born over in Poland in the city of Yugostov or Augustova, and part of the ghetto culture over there. His father, he was the youngest of 8 children, and his father, Israel David Levitt, had come over here to the United States to try to get started, and he came over when my father was an infant, but he came over with a lot of the older children. So my father didn't see his father for 5 years. He was in Poland, and finally he and his mother were brought over to New York City, and his mother had dressed him all up in a pretty little suit to see his father for the first time, and on the dock his father ripped the suit off of him and put on a suit that he had made, and he says, "You're an American boy now, you have to look like an American boy." And my father was then taken into New York City, and he was scared to death because he saw all these tall buildings, and he thought they were churches, because the only tall buildings he knew back in Europe were churches. And my father proved to be one of these little genius kids who just adored school and went to school. By the time he was 18, he had graduated medical school. I mean, he zipped right through. And on one of his trips back down to Baltimore Medical School, where he had started, coming back, he and his friend ran into some rain, and his friend said, "I have somebody that I know who lives in this town of Chester." And so they went over and knocked on the door, and they were taken in for the night. My mother at the time was 15, and my father was like 11 years older. And, nothing happened. A year later, he wrote to her, and he said, "You're 16 now, and I know that I can write to you." And he came down to visit. And by the time she was 17, they were married. By the time she was 18, she had my brother Dan. My father was practicing in a state hospital. He was a psychiatrist. And they first started out on Long Island, and then moved into Brooklyn. And my 2 brothers were born, and then I was the youngest. One brother was 10 years older, one brother was 7 years older. And I grew up in Brooklyn, in a brownstone where the office was in the house. And I had a delightful childhood, and I went to Midwood High School, but the one thing I loved was the outdoors and nature, and I wanted to get in the country. And I picked the University of Vermont because I wanted to get up into Vermont. And that was a very happy experience. And in the beginning of my sophomore year, we Jewish kids on the holidays, we didn't exactly go into the temple, but we went and stood outside the temple. There was just one Orthodox temple in Burlington, Vermont at the time. And so we were in a little group, and this young man in the group said, let's have some introductions. And that was Julian, my husband. And Julie had been born in West Rutland, Vermont, but his parents had come over also from Polish Russia. And whereas a lot of his aunts and uncles had gone directly to Palestine, so that he had a lot of Israeli relatives over there, but they were in this mining town in marble mining town, deepest marble quarry in the world in West Rutland, Vermont. His father lost everything he ever had in the 1929 crash, so that was the end of that. And then his father got sick and died. And his mother was left with 5 children and no money, so it was Franklin Roosevelt who kept them alive. But the fact that they could get scholarships to the University of Vermont, made all the difference. And 3 of the 4 boys went to medical school at the University of Vermont because they could get the scholarships. And when I met him, he had been in the Navy during the war, and now he was out, and he was in his freshman year of medical school. I was in my sophomore year of undergraduate school. This was in October, and by the next August we were married.
What were you studying at the University of Vermont?
I started studying psychology, but got into zoology and realized that biology and botany and that kind of thing was what I really loved. We got married, and I continued. I went through school, I finished, but by the time I graduated Vermont, I was 3 months pregnant. So I was not going into a career at that point. And we had our first child, Laura, up in Burlington, and he was finishing his senior year. And we were living by hook or by crook. But when he was, to shorten this, but when he was looking for his internship, because he was graduating, at that point my mother had died, and my father was living alone in Brooklyn. He was still practicing. But I wanted at least to pick an internship that would be within driving distance for him. Mm-hmm. And so we kept that in mind. Also, a lot of Vermont graduates, medical graduates, had interned at Stanford Hospital. Mm-hmm. And so he applied to Stanford Hospital, and we got in.
What year was that?
And that was 1950, 51. Yeah.
Okay.
And so we came down to Stanford, and Stanford at that point was maybe 50,000 people. It was a much smaller town. It did work out that my father came up every weekend to stay with us, so that was very nice.
Where were you living?
And first of all, when he started interning, it was desperate times then to find a place to live in Stanford. There was nothing. And finally, through one of the Queskin brothers, we sublet a Queskin apartment right down by the railroad, which is where the Thruway now is. Because that apartment house went down when they built the Thruway. Mm-hmm. And so it was a furnished apartment. We sublet that. And as I say, Laura was a baby. And while he was interning, he met Dr. Leo Heimovich and Dr. Saul Javen were partners and were quite successful at the time, and they got to like Julie by meeting him as an intern, and by the end of the year they had invited him to join as a junior in their practice. Well, of course, this was a very nice opportunity because we had been considering going on for him to get a pediatric residency somewhere else and so forth, but anyway, this settled in. And so we at that point we had to find another place to live because their lease was up. Meanwhile, they had built Ridgeway Apartments, which is now Chesterfield.
Okay. Bracewood Lane.
Bracewood Lane. And they were in the process of building it. There were delays. I had to go back and live in Brooklyn for a while and so forth, and then I was pregnant with Martha. Anyway, we moved into Bracewood Lane, which was a lot of fun because it was all young couples and all young couples with little kids, and everybody you know in town originally started at Bracewood Lane. When we moved in, it was a mud pile. And at one point, I almost lost Laura in the mud. It was really kind of scary. And while we were living there, Martha was born, and Julie was with Heimovich and Javen. And which came first? So then, after a time, Heimovich and Javen had a big divorce. I mean, it was really a divorce. The two practices split up. And things started to change, and finally Julie decided to go out on his own. And we found this little office in a private house at the corner of Hoyt and Bedford, which was a private home that this man had made an office in part of the house. So that's where we moved. Well, we put the office. And meanwhile, we were living at Bracewood Lane, and Julie was making a house call, which to a man across the street here in Ridge Park Avenue, Bill Ryan, and Regan. And Regan mentioned that this house, 88, they were looking to sell, but they hadn't put on the market yet. And my father came up, and we all went through it, and 1, 2, 3, we bought the house at the right price of $18,000.
In what year was that?
This
by that time?
was 53. And at that point, this was a one-floor house with 3 bedrooms. And since that time, we added on the second story and so forth and so on. And at that point, Julie had Helen Coslow was his nurse in the office. And it was a very lovely arrangement. And I kept having kids, and John was born in 54, and Beth was born in 56, and they had a wonderful childhood here. They really have wonderful, wonderful memories of growing up here. There were lots of children around, and as you know, at that time, kids went out and played, and then they built the field in back here was then put up to become, Yale Court. Which was the first Feber and Lampke thing. So we watched that go up. And we got friendly with the people on that street. My best friend moved in, Phyllis Masser. So it was kind of a joyous time. And then when Beth was about 5 years old and had started kindergarten. So at this point, all my kids were in school, and at that point Helen Coslow was moving out of town, and I went down temporarily to help Julie in the office, and I stayed for 35 years. And so that was a lot of fun. At that point in 56, Julie had gotten together with 5 others, and they built their own medical building at 23 Hoyt Street. And that was Dr. Jim Moriarty, Dr. Lynch, who was a dentist, Dr. John Posabut, Dr. Fred McIntyre, and Dr. John Nagel. And the 5 of them put up the building, and that turned out to be a very, very happy relationship. Those guys really got along, and Julie, they kind of put in charge of kind of running the place, but they depended on him, and I have to say it was a very interesting relationship because we had all the Catholics, 1 Protestant, and 1 Jew, and they loved each other. They had a great time together. Particularly, Julie and Jim Moriarty became bosom buddies, because they had the same kind of sense of humor, and they really teased the hell out of each other. And Jim used to disappear from his office upstairs down the back steps and come in Julie's office and steal his sandwich and sit down and yak with him. They were quite the characters. They really were. They were a lot of fun to work with. Now, I can go on then where I went from this, because I took on a career when I was in my 40s, but I don't know where you want me to stop with all this.
No, we're not going to have you stop. You are a wonderful, telling a wonderful story. I love it, without me prodding too much. Since we are the Jewish Historical Society,
Like something Jewish.
we'd like to, did you have any affiliation?
Okay. When my kids were little, we were among the first to join Temple Sinai when it was down on Grove Street. I think it had been going for about a year, and with Rabbi Marks, and we joined, and the kids started with this, Sunday school and so forth. And then, of course, we saw the whole building of Temple Sinai up on Lakeside. And then we saw the beginnings of Rabbi Silver, and we went through all of Rabbi Silver's years. The girls were confirmed and not bat mitzvah, but John was bar mitzvah at Temple Sinai, and that was fun. And the weddings my kids had were through Temple Sinai. Our first wedding was my daughter Martha, who married Terry O'Brien, and Sam was, would do it. So that was in the temple. And then, of course, Martha's marriage, that didn't last. And when Martha remarried to Marty Kaminsky, it was up in Ithaca where they were living. Laura got married to Rick, and that was Rabbi Pierce, and that was in the temple.
And last name Rick?
Kitai. And John was married out in Chicago area because he married Claudia, came from Aurora, Illinois, but Claudia, who was Midwest, went through the whole conversion. I mean, John's attitude, he's not a religious person at all, but it meant something to him.
Beautiful. That
his children would be Jewish and so forth, and she took it right on. At that point, they were living in Oregon because he was doing his postdoc, but she went to a Orthodox rabbi out there and went through the whole thing with the mikveh and what have you. Since then, they haven't done anything.
But the children
know they're Jewish. And her parents were just really lovely about it. And when she had the conversion, they bought her a necklace with a chai on it. Beautiful. And so forth. So, when Beth got married, Beth also married somebody who's not Jewish, but was perfectly agreeable to go along with anything she wanted. And at that point, it was also Rabbi Pierce. And Beth was very nervous about the whole thing, so we had the service here. We cleaned out the living room and we had the service here, and then we had a reception at Le Chateau. But it was a whole Jewish thing with the chuppah. And so that's fine. And Beth's and Bill's son Levi has been brought up Jewish and was bar mitzvahed with Rabbi Disick.
Okay.
Here. And Bill's parents, who never set foot inside of a temple and knew from nothing, I have to say that Rabbi Disick did a wonderful job of including them, and they were very impressed.
So she's local? Beth is local?
And Beth now lives right across the street.
Oh, that's great.
And that's been the saving grace for me. She's been there now quite a long time. And Levi grew up here. So she's like my best buddy.
I love that. It's nice to have that relationship so close. And
And
her son is,
Laura lives up in Glastonbury, which is about an hour and a half away. But they're, we really live together because we have our dinners together and everything.
that is wonderful.
So, and she's a lot of fun.
Okay. If there, sometimes I can catch you off guard on this question, but when the children or when you were going to school, did you find it easy being Jewish or not easy being Jewish?
You mean when I grew up? When
Both, either one. If you have any memories of when you were growing up in Brooklyn and great.
All right, my children found it very easy. It was not a question, and it was not a problem. I mean, around here there was quite a mixture of kids, and it wasn't a question at all. Although there was one single time Beth told me, and Beth has a mouth on her. She was coming home from grade school, and some boy made some kind of stupid remark. And she turned and she really gave it to him. I wish I could remember what she said, but boy did she tell him off. So they weren't shy about it. All right, when I grew up in Brooklyn, of course we're going through the 1930s when the whole thing was starting in Germany. We're going through the World War II. I mean, this was all out there. Where I lived in Brooklyn was interesting because New York Avenue, where I lived with the Brownstones, was all Jewish doctors. The cross streets were all Irish Catholics for some reason. And there was this church around the corner, St. Gregory's, that was anti-Semitic. I mean, there was no getting away with it. And, I remember we played with the Catholic kids, and mostly it was fine, but I remember there was some incidents that went on. All right, I remember once when Roosevelt won, the second or third election, and this Irish kid from around the corner threw some ice at me and he said something about, I bet you're glad Rosenberg won. With this kind of stuff. It was not a major thing in my life, but there were certainly incidents.
You were aware.
Yes, very much aware. There are other instances. My sister-in-law, Peg, whose name was Bernstein, had graduated from Smith and then was working, changed her name to Byrne, and was working in New York City at a fancy magazine, and I can't remember, it was something like Vogue or one of those. And she got in the elevator and bumped into an old friend that she hadn't seen in a long time. And the friend said to her, "Oh, Peggy Bernstein, how are you?" And, fine. And the next thing she knew, she was called into the main office. "Why didn't you tell us your name was Bernstein? Why didn't you tell us you were Jewish?" And they fired her.
Wow.
So.
What happened after that?
She left.
She left?
Yeah, what's she going to do? I also remember that my brother Mike, originally, before he went to med school, he wanted to be a chemist. And he was advised, don't go into chemistry because you won't get a job, because DuPont was not hiring Jews.
Mm-hmm. And his last name was?
Was Levitt. It was innocuous, but they would know. I guess they would ask on the
Levitt. No, I think Levitt is.
Well, there's also New England Levitt, Leavitt. It can be either way, but
okay.
But they would probably ask on the application, what your religion was or something like that.
In those days they could.
Yeah. I remember another thing, my cousin Phil Cohn, who wanted to work for the phone company. And they were told they weren't taking Jews. And he changed his name to his friend's name, was Italian, Ciabatti. He became Phil Ciabatti and was immediately hired. So there was all that stuff going on, and you knew it.
Interesting.
But
So now tell us about...
One thing
yes.
other, I hear you're bringing these things back. When I went to the University of Vermont, everybody's very friendly, so forth and so on, and I started rooming the second year with the gal that I became most friendly with, which was Priscilla Oakland. And Pris told me that some of the other girls said to her, "How can you live with a Jewish girl?"
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah. It's the world we live in,
yeah.
right? We're going to get to that. You wanted to talk about your second career?
Yeah, if
And-
you want.
No, sure. We want to know how you decided to take a new line, and also after that we would love to talk about your travels. Just a few of them.
All right. I'm gonna keep this short. When my kids were growing up, and maybe Beth was a young teenager, and the rest some were in college already, and I realized, I was working in the office, but that was a part-time job. Then I wanted to see what else I was going to do. What was I going to do when I grew up was what I kept saying to everybody. And so I decided biology, and maybe I would teach biology in high school or whatever, and I went to Fairfield University, and I got a master's in education for teaching biology. And I
How long did that take you?
a couple of years, because it was
Part-time.
and then I did some student teaching here at the local high schools, but I still wasn't ready to convert over to a full-time teaching position. Meanwhile, I became buddies with Walter Plant. I don't know if you remember him, but he was the science teacher at RIP, and he became head of the department, and he's an absolute amazingly wonderful man, and he became my mentor. And he said to me, you should really go down to the botanical garden and get their certificate in botany, because he and his wife Mary were really into botany and nature and wildlife. And so because he said that, I went down and started taking the first course in botany at NYBG, and I fell in love. I just fell in love. It was like I'd come home. And so I proceeded to take all the certificate courses to get the certificate of botany that you get there, and I just adored it. And when I finally finished and got the certificate, a friend of mine mailed me a clipping from the New York Times where they were NYBG was looking for an instructor in field botany. And I thought, I can't do this, but if I don't call, I'll never know. And I called, the man who had been one of my teachers was the head of the thing, and I went down to talk to him. And he was pretty desperate because this one man had just quit in the middle, and they needed somebody. And he said, "I'll try you." So I've been there ever since. I've been teaching there since the 70s. And I've worked up to teaching a lot of other courses there. And I really didn't know what I was doing when I started, but I learned as I went. And it's just become my life. I'm very involved in a lot of botanical societies, and I go on a lot of botanical foray trips that take me to all kinds of
So this is where
interesting
your
places.
love for travel?
Yeah, that's what started my love for travel. Now, a lot of the travel I've done has also not been involved with botanical. But these botanical societies run 5-day forays every year in different parts of this country. And like, for example, I'm going on a foray in June up to Williamstown, Massachusetts. And we stay in, college dormitories or in real dumpy places. And it's all very, down to earth. And we just learn and learn and learn. And it's just been wonderful. And so I've also gotten involved leading a lot of walks for these things. And so I'm on the board of the Bartlett Arboretum, and I'm on the board of the Torrey Botanical Society at the NYBG, which is the oldest one in the world. No, in the United States. And I'm on the board of the Connecticut Botanical Society. And I'm also with this mushroom group, and on and on and on. And a big part in my life now is, I'll try to make this brief, there's a bunch of us, women really and one man, who all have this same interest, and we get together every Monday, rain or storm, and we go to another nature preserve and spend the day hiking. And we've been named the Alpha Sacs, which is Audubon Ladies Fresh Air and Standing Around Club.
And how many are you?
It fluctuates. This thing has been going on, not with me, but it's been going on about 35 years. People have died, people have joined, and it's a self-perpetuating thing. And I've been in it about 12 years. And it fluctuates between 8 and 12 people.
Great. That sounds very interesting. You want to take a break? Okay, Carol.
Well, just to finish with my nature end of this, I did write this book, and it was published by Yale University Press, and it's called A Guide to Wildflowers in Winter, and it's how to identify plants when they don't have their flowers on them, and how you can identify them by all the other attachments that they have, so that you can take the book out in winter and identify flowers. And I got together with a man that I met at the garden, Dick Rao, who's an absolutely wonderful illustrator artist, and he did a wonderful job of drawing the pictures. I did all the collecting of the flowers and did the text. And it's been successful, I mean, considering it's
When did it come out?
It came out in 1995. And the last I knew, it's, for a nature book, it's sold about 8,000 copies, so it's, and they continue to publish it.
Great.
And meanwhile, I've been working, well, never mind, on another thing that's, a mentor of mine I should mention is Sam Ristich, who recently died in his 90s, but I met him because he was teaching at the New York Botanical Garden, and there's a whole bunch of us who are his disciples. And he took wonderful slides of seeds, which I've been trying to publish a book about with his pictures, but we'll see. Anyway, he moved back. I'm not going to get into Sam Ristich, that's a whole other story. He's got his own story. But it's interesting because he's a Serbian immigrant. He grew up in Pittsburgh in the steel mills and utter poverty, and went through scholarships to Pittsburgh schools. And he's a genius, an absolute genius as far as nature is concerned.
Right.
And he became, a lot of us were his mentors. We
Great.
miss him very much.
Okay.
All right.
So this has taken you on travels and trips, and you can mention a few of your favorites.
I also have to mention, though, that another reason for the trips was because later years Julie became medical director at Pitney Bowes. Now that's Stanford. And by being medical director at Pitney Bowes, they would have a once-a-year sales reward conference, and they would have it. If a fellow made a certain amount of sales or whatever, he could go on the conference, and they would have it at various very beautiful spots around the country, and they wanted their own doctor, and so we got to go.
Wonderful.
And Julie worked, but I had a great old time.
That's great. So now that we're still talking about Julian,
Yeah.
Julie, and how he worked also not only with Pitney Bowes, but he
had
medical practice.
He started with private general practice, and that's what he did. I mean, he ran the office at the same time, and it was general practice. I'm sorry. And he was very much the family practitioner, and he was very much involved with the families that he was. And he started off doing house calls.
House calls, I remember.
And he just loved his patients, and I think mostly they loved him. It was very, very intimate family kind of thing.
Absolutely. I can mention that he was my doctor growing up. I remember him. So was there any he was connected to Stanford Hospital?
Yes, and St. Joe's.
And St. Joe's, that's correct. Was there any feeling being a Jewish doctor in these facilities?
I didn't find it. I didn't see it at all. I mean, there were a lot of Jewish doctors. I can tell you a cute story about Jakey Nemoyton.
Sure.
Jakey Nemoyton was one of the old time.
Yes.
And when Julie started interning, Jakey was the old time doctor. And of course, Jakey was the one who delivered all the Italian babies and what have you. And he had his accent, and he was a real general practitioner. Julie was telling me one time he was in the emergency room, and Jakey was in the emergency room, and he was putting a cast on somebody's arm, and the patient was, doctor, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he says, I have to do this so the muscles wouldn't wiggle.
Great. Great. It's wonderful. We need this because
wiggle.
Jacob Nemoyton is one of our stars in our archives, and so a personal story like that adds to this.
Well, and then the story was, that he would give to everybody, and then it was his wife who would sit in the office and take him the money and push him to make a living because he wasn't paying attention.
Right.
So, but Julie really enjoyed his practice, and as far as the Jewish thing, as I say, he and Jim Moriarty were a pair, and they covered each other, and they would cover each other. They weren't partners per se, but they covered each other, and so forth. And I understand, and then John Posebut actually had come from Vermont by way of Poland also, so Julie had known him up there. I understand that when Julie, and this was told to me by a number of people, that after Julie passed away and they had the Medical Society meeting, and they asked John Nagel and John Posebut to get up and say a few words. And apparently they had everybody in tears, that John himself was just, couldn't stop crying. And
he touched them.
Yeah.
He touched everyone.
So,
And he had died in
97.
97. So travels.
So, with Pitney Bowes, I got down to Acapulco, and that was a disaster because everybody got sick. Everybody got sick.
He had a
We weren't. Julie and I didn't get sick, but boy, out of 1,200 people, he must have treated at least 400.
Wow.
And they had to send back to the States for more medicine. I mean, talk about Montezuma's revenge. And they had their own water at that hotel, and everybody was supposed to be so careful, and that was a mess. All right, that was one of my travels. My own travels. I mean, I started out with botanical travels, like, my friend Carol Gracie, who worked at NYBG, she ran these trips. And the first one that I went on with her, that was purely nature and without Julie, was Trinidad. And it was a beautiful, beautiful trip. I mean, we saw, scarlet ibis and the monkeys and and I almost stepped on a fer de lance, which is the most poisonous snake there is known to man. And it was lying across the sidewalk. And I called everybody, hey, come see the snake. And the guides came and they said, this is a fer de lance. I mean, so that was kind of interesting. And then a very impressive trip that I went with through Carol was on the Amazon at the flood. And we were in canoes at the tops of the trees, looking at the orchids. Because the flood was 56 feet high, and these trees survived in the flood. And we were visiting the caboclos, the native people who are Indian but speak Portuguese, and we went in their cabins and we laid in their hammocks, and it was, I could show you slides, it was a stupendous trip. And and the man who ran the boat, the river boat that we were on, was called Mo, and he was a caboclos, and he was a real entrepreneur. He now has 5 boats. He started with 1 boat. And we just recently saw him. He came to New York for the first time.
So, you did do some traveling with Julian.
Oh yes, we
To
went to
Israel.
Israel, and we had another wonderful cruise that he and I took, was on the Baltic Sea. You know, doing St. Petersburg and Helsinki and Danzig and so forth. That was he liked cruises. And another one that we did a long time ago that he really enjoyed was a Swan Hellenic cruise, which is a cruise that's it's out of England, but you cruise from Venice down through the Greek islands and into Turkey and so forth. But the thing about that boat was, this English boat, was that they had lecturers on board about the archaeology, but they also had on a professional botanist named Philip Cribb, and I became buddies with him, and he took me to see orchids and what have you. And since that time I've had him back here visiting at the New York Botanical. He was with Kew Gardens, and so that was exciting. And Julie, as part of Pitney Bowes, Julie and I did Hawaii twice, so that was kind of nice.
You're a world traveler. You were
Yeah.
talking about all your photographs. You do photography also?
Yeah.
Have you gone to digital?
I'm getting into digital, but I still haven't bought the proper camera, and I'm still showing slides instead of PowerPoint, and I've got to get off the stick and get into PowerPoint.
And when you do, the whole world will change.
I know.
So I'm trying to think if we've covered everything we really would like to cover. If you
Well, I
have.
went to the Antarctica.
Oh, good.
That I went with my brother, and that was after Julia passed away.
Mhm.
And then Louise Stern and I went to China, and I traveled with my friend Phyllis, and we went to Australia, New
Phyllis.
Zealand, and
Your last
Phyllis
name?
Masser.
Okay, Master the one.
And she's passed away,
Oh.
but I miss her very much.
Sure.
Because she and I did Alaska and Australia and South Africa.
When do you have time to be home? So this is your home.
Yeah, I've been, you know, this house has been great because it's a small house, but it was big enough to bring up the 4 kids. And now it's not too big. And particularly because I have Beth across the street. And as I say, I'm going out of here feet first. So.
Okay. So if there is nothing else that we would like to add to our video, you will be getting a copy of it that you'll be able to share with your family. You can check it first, but it will also be for anyone else who might be interested in knowing what it was like to be living in Stamford and being Jewish. So thank you so much for your time. You were a delight. I loved it. Thank you.
You're very patient.